Good evening and welcome to another edition of RADTV UK. Tonight we lead on Cyprus, and then we've got a couple of local campaigns here in the UK. The G8 are coming to the UK and there's going to be a lot of protests. We've got the sad demise of the Socialist Workers' Party, a once great protest leading party in the UK, no longer. We've got a good news story about the rice harvest in India, how to get it up. It's going sky high without any GMOs, without too many pesticides. Then we've got reports on Syria. The conflict continues, the latest twists and turns. We're going to see how the blackmail system possibly works at controlling politicians through sex allegations and other ways, through blackmail. And then finally we've got the pictures they'd rather not we remembered, the Hollywood stars who 10 years ago, over 10 years ago now, backed the American attack on Afghanistan in a rather foolish way. Have the bankers got it right? Has the media got it right? It's the big story of the week. The banks have gone bust and there's another bailout. Another country gets crushed by the bankers. But some say it's a little different. Rich depositors are having to cough up rather than taxpayers. That's what they said in the Financial Times. Should Cyprus leave the euro? Is there a hidden agenda? Clive Menzies of Critical Thinking is our financial commentator. Clive, you've been looking at history?
Yes, indeed, Ian. If we go back to 1820, after the Napoleonic Wars, the small island of Guernsey was in a dire state. They had crumbling seawalls, their roads had ruts so deep that cartwheels wouldn't actually hit the ground within them, and they had no markets, so there was very little trade going on. And they came up with the bright idea of issuing their own interest-free currency. And the government issued the currency, spent it into the economy to repair the seawalls, rebuild the roads, and to build a market. And it was interest-free. It flowed into the economy, and as materials were bought and people were paid, the money began to circulate, and they regulated it through taxation to make sure that it didn't cause inflation.
So they had everything except the money to make an economy work. They didn't have the money, so they printed it.
Exactly.
And a lot of people, of course, would say, well, that's going to cause inflation if you print money like there's no tomorrow. But they had a system for dealing with that as well.
Exactly. They used taxation to moderate the money supply so that inflation wasn't a problem. And what they ended up with was a thriving economy. The market house was completed 2 years later in 1822 with no debt incurred. And after 10 years, it was so successful that it attracted the attention of the bankers from England.
The bankers moved in.
Who hadn't been around at the original time. When they needed English pounds, there were no banks. And so they were able to issue their own currency because there was no opposition from the banks. When the banks learned how prosperous they were, they arrived and they lobbied really hard to stop the issue of the island's own currency. And they succeeded 6 years later in 1836.
And now we've got Cyprus, another small country which is in despair and disaster. And their approach might be also to start printing their own money, as might Greece. They mostly seem to be short of country, these economies. They've still got the people, still got the resources.
Exactly. I mean, arguably, every country should issue their own interest-free currency, and that way there would be no government debt. But let's take the issue of Cyprus. Cyprus is already in the stranglehold of the banks, and because of the losses of their banks in the Greek bank system, they're needing a bailout, 10 billion euros. And they're being put under a stranglehold of austerity and privatization of their assets. Now, if the Cypriots really want to liberate themselves, they need to issue their own interest-free currency. They've got formidable strengths economically. They can grow their own food, which is more than we can say for ourselves in this country. They've got potentially a very vibrant tourist industry, certainly in the past and could be again in the future. And they've got very valuable gas reserves. So they've got a lot going for them. So they don't actually need anybody else. They can then trade on their own terms on that basis.
How very interesting. So they could go the same way as Iceland, but there's a lot more people who've got an interest in Cyprus than had in Iceland who did this successfully, or something like it, I believe.
Well, yes, I suppose to some extent Cyprus is blighted by being the paradise that it is because it's attracted a lot of people. It's also a big offshore banking centre with a lot of Russian oligarch money in there, allegedly, although I've read stories recently to say that they're not actually keeping as much money in there as one may assume. But nonetheless, between Russia and the Troika, which is the ECB, the IMF and the European Union, both those parties want to get control of Cyprus's assets, probably most importantly the gas. And so there are risks in what I'm suggesting, because as we know, the attraction of natural resources, particularly oil and gas, is likely to provoke conflict. And
it's the curse of the oil, isn't it?
Exactly.
Colonel Gaddafi, Saddam Hussein, they all had oil. Well, thank you very much, Clive.
Pleasure.
Well, back here in the UK, it's not so far away from Cyprus. There's also a lot of poverty and a lot of suffering. And there's two campaigns that are going to be doing something about this, or trying to do something about this in the next few months. First of all, we've got the very effective high-profile group UK Uncut, who are campaigning on the benefits cuts issue, with a day of mass civil disobedience in April. And then we've got the G8 summit, which is coming to town, or at least coming to Northern Ireland, with protests called in London and no doubt later in Northern Ireland. They're coming in June. So our woman on the spot, Fran, you've been looking into this, Fran, and how are these campaigns being planned?
Yes, well, UK Uncut have announced a massive day of action, civil disobedience, on Saturday the 13th of April, and their focus is on the bedroom tax and the benefit cap. Both policies are disproportionately affecting people in desperate need, and as the UK Uncut supporters say, people on benefits aren't the problem. We know it's the banking system, tax avoidance and the government's austerity policies. And
what are they going to, do we have any idea how these campaigns are going to, this campaign's going to shape up, what they're going to be up to?
Well, they're saying that they want to evict a millionaire from having too many spare bedrooms, so to bring the cuts home to those that are responsible for implementing them, such as millionaires and politicians. And they're not really releasing a lot of details because they tend to get targeted by the police quite a lot. So you basically have to go on their website and register, and they will send you more details as they come in.
So it's going to be a sort of crowdsourcing type action where these guys are going to appear, and you have to. Well, we're going to be screening the website. It's not too hard to find. No doubt they've got clever ways of stopping themselves being infiltrated, and we'll see some interesting news reports of some of the millionaires who they're going to be targeting, I suppose.
The other campaign is Stop the G8 Network. And they're calling for a week of action in London from the 10th of June to the 14th of June, and they're holding a carnival against capitalism in the West End of London on June the 11th. And basically the G8 is holding a conference in Fermanagh in Northern Ireland, and I expect probably the Northern Irish activists are organising something there themselves, and so there'll be an opportunity if you want to go there to protest as well.
Well, the G8 are certainly, in many people's eyes, the sort of heart of the problem, really. They include Russia, but they don't include any of the emerging economies. They're basically, some would say, the voice of the Western banking system. So a lot of people will be thinking that it's time to confront them, and possibly they've gone to Northern Ireland because they're used to being very unpopular in Northern Ireland.
That's right, and as the organisers are saying, the real problem is unregulated capitalism, and rather than ordinary people causing austerity, it's actually unregulated capitalism and the banking system being unregulated. And so they're going there to challenge the G8 leaders on the ideology that the G8 leaders are promoting.
Yes, because they would be the people to regulate the banking system should they want to. But certainly they could be regulating the banking system, but they're much more likely to be trying to get another war going, perhaps. Perhaps we're being too cynical here. Thanks, Fran.
Yeah. The SWP, the once revolutionary party, apparently disaster has struck this party lately, and Ian's been looking to it. So what's happening, Ian?
Well, the SWP has always been a controversial party, very, very tightly controlled. Some people have called it a cult, but they have always been very clear that they oppose American imperialism. They made their name as international socialists in the Vietnam era. They were right at the forefront of the protests against the invasion of Iraq. And they seem to have had some sort of a nervous breakdown. They're now supporting the rebels in Syria. So they're up there, you know, in line with the CIA and the French military and Al-Qaeda, which many people would have thought would be the exact opposite of what you'd expect from a party called the Socialist Workers' Party. They've bought into the vilification of Julian Assange. So while somebody like John Pilger and many people are saying that Julian Assange is a hero, they're going with these charges that he's a rapist, which a lot of people think, especially on the left, a lot of people think they're just obvious trumped up charges that you'd expect America to bring against somebody that they don't like. Well, the Socialist Workers' Party think these charges are justified. And they're saying that George Galloway, who's another leftist, you know, a very solid anti-American leftist who supports Julian Assange, they're calling him a rape denier. So it really is looking a bit like some sort of a collective nervous breakdown.
It certainly does, Ian. And wasn't there some allegations that some of the people at the top level of the SWP were actually involved in some kind of sexual harassment?
Well, this is what's brought it all to a head, because the people who are raising this rape pro-America sort of position, they seem to be the more junior ones at the moment, on the up. And having captured the leadership's support for their line on rape, which is now that rape's the most important thing in the world, even if it's possibly even not rape, and certainly more important than something like WikiLeaks. Having pushed that line on the leadership, they've now brought out the information that some of the leadership are alleged to be rapists themselves, or at least sexual abusers. Who knows what it means any longer, the word rape. So, which is now so most important in the world, even even not and so more important so WikiLeaks. So push that so on the lead. So they've information that they're now stuck with it themselves, and so it's a sort of classic Stalinist sort of coup that seems to be unwinding before everybody's eyes. It's an extraordinary story.
And didn't Annie Machon, MI5 whistleblower, have something interesting to say about the SWP?
Well, Annie Machon says that when she was in MI5 in the early 90s and mid-90s, the SWP was heavily infiltrated by MI5. So, but then they took them out after the Cold War. So maybe they never took them out. Maybe Israel's moved in. You get this interesting concept of a rape denier. That to me has got a slightly Israeli sort of ring to it, that concept. They call anybody they disagree with deniers. Those, you know, very aggressive pro-Israel activists. But also we've seen a different analysis from a traditional Trotskyist website who have very good analysis on issues like 9/11, the World Socialist website. And what they're saying is that they're not interested in these sort of analysis. They're saying that it's just because the leadership of the Socialist Workers' Party are actually quite wealthy middle-class people, and they're just not working class in any sense. So why would they continue to support working class interests? They've been captured not by infiltration, but ideologically, by this sort of ideological wing of the people who, so whether it's infiltration from sort of invisibly from within, or ideological capture by people who are well off and believe what they read in The Guardian, we don't know, but certainly something's gone terribly wrong with the Socialist Workers' Party.
Well, thank you, Ian.
Next we have a great good news story from India, where they seem to be achieving phenomenal results in growing crops. Is that right, Ian?
Well, it seems to be the case, yeah. It's called India's Rice Revolution, new high-yield system that requires no genetically modified seed, little herbicide. No one can believe the yields they're getting by something as simple as a new way of crop planting. They're just popping out the rice at a slightly different age, in a slightly different way, with slightly different levels of watering in the paddy fields, and it seems to be bringing the most extraordinary harvests.
And has it provoked any sort of scepticism amongst the established community, particularly the GM community?
Well, I'm sure the GM community would love to cast cold water on it. And of course you have to be sceptical. You get these freak stories, you know, you find, you quite often find with alleged UFO sightings that there's a farmer who's collecting money for people to go and see the site, you know, so that you have to be suspicious. But the Guardian John Vidal is the Guardian's, the English newspaper, the Guardian's environment correspondent. He's flown out there, and the report is, you know, that this is kosher, this is on the level. The Bihar State Agricultural Universities didn't believe him at first. This is what Vidal's saying. While India's leading rice scientists muttered about freak results, possibly they're subsidised by the GM lobby, who knows. The Nalanda farmers were accused of cheating. Only when the state's head of agriculture, a rice farmer himself, came to the village with his own men and measured the crop, and it seems to be a solid story. But of course, the sad thing about a story like this is that nobody's got much of an interest in disseminating it. Even if it's true, we might not hear a lot more about it, and still the pundits will go on saying how you can't feed the world with organic food and GM's necessary to keep Africa. All the same tired old arguments we've heard, which were never probably true. But, you know, let's hope for the best, and let's hope that at least this village in India feeds itself and spreads the news along the grassroots to the other Indian farmers.
Well, not only bad news travels, good news also travels, and also the fact that it's going out on here tonight, and I'm sure that people hearing about it will talk to others, so it could be the start of a new revolution.
It's a good news story.
Indeed.
West seeks to strengthen Syrian opposition as rebel activities falter. Support for the Syrian rebels from places like the Socialist Workers' Party is even more bizarre in view of the latest revelations as to just who these Syrian rebels are. And allegations that the Assad regime has been using chemical weapons seem to have evaporated, and possibly the rebels are doing that as well. And now also we're seeing the leadership in turmoil with yet another new rebel leader. So our man, if not in Syria, reading the news from Syria closely, is Roy. Roy, what is this about the chemical weapons?
Well, first of all, they're not chemical weapons. There was a chemical attack happened on the 19th, Tuesday the 19th of March. But it's been reclassified now. It wasn't actually chemical weapons, it's now a chemical damage agent. And what it basically was a missile with some chlorine in it, basically. It did manage to kill 26 people, including government troops. So, I mean, it wasn't completely innocuous. But for the UN classification, it's not a chemical weapon, which is a little bit disappointing, I think, for the Western powers, because they're looking for an excuse really to lift the arms embargo to help the rebels,
who they're allied with.
Yeah. I think we all understand that the rebels are being controlled to a certain degree.
Yeah, there's no real dispute about that.
No.
And the West initially screamed about this apparent chemical attack and demanded an investigation by the UN.
Indeed, yeah. Well, Obama had put it down as one of his red lines, so if chemical weapons were used in Syria, that gave everybody the excuse to go in and exacerbate the conflict.
Right.
So,
and then what happened?
Well, everybody would rub their hands together and thought this was their opportunity, but then it seems, with a little bit of investigation, everybody's asked the UN to investigate, but now the Brits and the French and the Americans are kind of backing off from that.
So
because it does seem that it's certainly not the Assad regime.
So on the one hand, you've got the Assad government who lost troops in the attack, and they're still asking for an investigation.
Yeah, indeed, yeah.
On the other hand, you've got our friend David Cameron, who've initially asked for an investigation, but is no longer asking for an investigation.
No, they're backpedaling on that now, because the missile came from the area of Al-Bab and was fired at the outskirts of Aleppo, and Al-Bab is controlled by Jabhat al-Nusra, which is...
So apparently the missile came from the rebels.
From the rebel, from the rebel
it looks a bit
territory.
like it. Okay.
Yeah.
So now let's get on to the issue of the leadership of the rebels. There's been a change of leadership lately?
Yeah, there's always been a very loose structure for the leadership of the rebels, and that was one of the reasons why the West couldn't really arm them, because they've got no idea who's getting the weapons. And it does seem that there are fake rebel groups really who are going, give us weapons, and then taking them away, not necessarily fighting the Assad regime. So that's one of the reasons the West have been reluctant to arm them really. So Khatib has resigned now, and Ghassan Hito has been put in his place.
And where does he come from?
Well, he's been a resident in the US now for 30 years.
30 years in the US?
30 years in the US. He's got a degree in computer science from Purdue University.
So let's get this right. The leadership of the so-called Syrian rebels has lived in the US for the last 30 years, and he's a graduate of a US university, and presumably speaks in perfect English for the benefit of propaganda in America. But that can't be very impressive to the Syrian people.
Well, I think he's quite fluent in Arabic as well, but he has been described as a Texan with Islamist leanings.
Texan with Islamist leanings. And then the guy he replaced, there's an amazing story about him as well, I think, isn't there?
Yeah, he's apparently the son of the leader that was in place during the French colonial rule.
That's right, we dug out a picture of this.
Yeah.
And his grandfather was a big collaborator with the French Empire, and then it turned out that he's there collaborating again with the modern French Empire. Indeed. In a sense. I wonder if that was what led to his removal as the leader.
I don't think he was removed. He did resign, and he has been asked to come back actually, and he seems to be making moves in that direction.
So he's back in. So we've got a French collaborator's grandson and a Texan with Islamist leanings.
Indeed.
Well, thanks very much, Roy. It gets stranger and stranger.
It does indeed. So Ian is now going to talk about the way in which the politicians are controlled in this country and presumably across the world. I think we all know or suspect that bribery takes place, but Ian has a little information on perhaps the use of blackmail as well. Ian.
Yeah, well, here's the story. It's come out in the main UK papers, and it's been picked up by, the more opposition sites around the world. I don't think so by the mainstream media, because it's a bit of a giveaway, some people would say. Hundreds of files on celebrities, politicians and other VIPs accused of sex attacks and abuse was so heavily protected by senior police that investigating officers could not access them. It emerged today. That's the story. So in other words, politicians, this has come out in connection with the Jimmy Savile scandal, where this well-known, very famous person was turned out to be a serial abuser and a serial rapist over a 20-30 year period from the heart of the BBC. Everybody's asking, why didn't people know about it? Well, now here's part of the answer: because it was kept secret. Ordinary police investigating an allegation against Jimmy Savile would not have been able to find out that there were many other allegations against him. That's as far as it goes in the mainstream media. However, for a long time, the more suspicious people have thought that politicians not only act as if they're bribed, but also sometimes seem to act as if they're being blackmailed. They never seem to do the right thing, even in defiance of public opinion.
Yeah. So if we take that to its logical conclusion, then is it possible that to get in certain positions of power within the power structure, then they almost won't let you get there unless they have something over you, something to
well, you have to ask who does have access to these files. Obviously MI5 does. Who's got access to top secret information kept by senior police officers? MI5, the Prime Minister of the day, the Home Office, maybe their friends in the media, that would be Rupert Murdoch. So you can imagine that there's a lot of people around with some very dark secrets like Jimmy Savile had, who know that so long as they don't upset Rupert Murdoch, the Prime Minister, the Home Office, then they're okay. But if they do step out of line, then it's going to be in the papers.
They can be whipped straight back into line immediately.
And this, of course, we all know about the bribery, what you might call the bright side. This is the dark side. We know about the money side. We know that Tony Blair and David Cameron both came to power after huge amounts of money were funneled into their so-called private offices. This looks a bit like it could be the dark side of how power's organised.
Yeah, another window into the...
Another window opens.
Yeah, thank you.
And finally, flashback to 2001. Hollywood stars salute Afghanistan's enduring freedom. 10 years on, and the photos they would probably rather forget, and not just because of the lines have got deeper on their faces. It's the Hollywood crowd who tarnished their image, perhaps forever, by supporting America's longest war. A war started in the name of freedom, aren't all wars, and ended in another Vietnam-type quagmire in Afghanistan. Here are some of the pics compiled by Sem Artur. Spot the useful idiots, cast members of Ocean's 11. Immediately after the Los Angeles premiere, the cast members of Ocean's 11 film left for Turkey on a Warner Brothers chartered Boeing 757. Couldn't the Pentagon even have paid for the plane? For a special screening for the US military personnel. And what a lot of idiots they look like, don't they? From the left of centre are Julia Roberts, Andy Garcia, Steven Soderbergh, director, producer Jerry Weintraub, and kneeling, Matt Damon and George Clooney and Brad Pitt standing. Most of them are wearing leathered US Air Force jackets. I don't suppose they went on to Afghanistan and risked anything other than their reputations. December 2001, and the bombs are dropping in Afghanistan, but war can be such fun, can't it? Pretty woman and feminist icon Julia Roberts, at least the Hollywood variety of feminist, sits in the cockpit of an F-15 fighter jet at NATO's Incirlik Air Base, Turkey. Angel of Death. Only 3 weeks before September the 11th, actress Angelina Jolie visited, or Angelina Jolie, I think we call her, visited the Jalusia Afghan refugee camp in Pakistan and was appointed as a goodwill ambassador 3 weeks before September the 11th. From June 2011, Miss Jolie has played a major role in the propaganda war against Syria by making 6 visits to Syrian refugee camps in Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon and occupied Iraq. So let's hope that Angela Jolie's visits to these refugee camps don't lead to the same sort of ghastly human disaster that followed her visit to that Afghan refugee camp over 10 years ago now. Maybe she should get back to making films. And that's our last item tonight. Thank you very much for watching RADTV UK. You can tell your friends about it. We're going wider and wider. We'd like to go fully public quite soon. Thank you very much for watching.